Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with some thoughts on the importance of the score, or should I say more specifically, fidelity to the score, in realizing an interpretation of a great piece of music, or a not so great piece of music, or any piece of music for that matter. What is a score? Let's start with the basics, shall we? I know this is going to sound simplistic, but I really think it's kind of important because quite often discussions start somewhere up here, ignoring the foundation down here. And unless we agree on what the terms of the debate are, we're not going to be able to have any sensible comment on it. So a score is not a piece of music. Not at all. It's a blueprint for producing a piece of music. And that is really a very, very different thing, isn't it? I mean, a map is not the location. It's the thing that shows you how to get to the location. Well, that's what a score is. And therefore, the printed score, the stuff in front of you, is only one part of the entire recipe, albeit a large part, because most interpreters, most performers regard the concept of score in a wider sense. In other words, it's not just what's on the printed page, obviously. It's what the things that are on the printed page mean. And in order to determine what they mean, you need to have a broader sense of the culture in which the score was written, and, if possible, the mind of the composer when writing the score. That is, virtually impossible. There you're dealing with the ability of the artist to put him or herself in the shoes of the actual composer and try and ferret out what the composer might have meant, especially when there are questionable areas, as there always are, because no score is 100% clear in what it wants, even when it's marked with unbelievable meticulousness. Now, music historians will tell you that the nature of scores changed over time. That is, in the early period, they were really quite sketchy. They depended on an awful lot of input from the performers, sometimes for everything: tempo, dynamics, orchestration, if it was an orchestral work. You just got the real basic skeleton, and it was up to the players to flesh it out however they wanted. As time went on, composers wanted to take stricter control over what their performers were doing, and they marked their scores with ever greater meticulousness and detail. But the fact of the matter is that they are just as reliant on the whims of the performers as people in the earlier period. Maybe not for all of the same parameters, but in order to realize all of the stuff that they've put in there. And one of the things that always fascinated me as a music critic when I was looking at scores was just how much gets ignored. I mean, even in the most meticulously marked scores, you find that, 75% of it goes by the wayside. I mean, not the actual notes, of course, as sometimes happened before, but in terms of balance and color and accent and articulation, it has always amused me when a new critical edition comes out and you see recordings that they say, based on the new critical edition of the Beethoven Symphonies by Jonathan Del Mar. There's an example of one. Why do these things happen? Everybody knows what the Beethoven symphonies are. Everybody knows what Beethoven wrote, basically. And yes, there may be some points of articulation or other things that you can go back and look at again and say, well, this didn't make it into this last edition, so I'm going to put it in the new edition. But the fact of the matter is that most of all of that detail is going to be completely disregarded by the performers for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're playing from their knowledge of the work, which goes back well before the publication of the latest critical edition, and they play what they know, not necessarily what the publishers printed, number one. And number two, a lot of what they print is simply impractical in regular performance. The conductor may say, play it at this tempo, which makes doing all of the articulation that they so carefully put in there impossible. He may say, accent it this way because I like it that way, which conductors have every right to do. And the performers have a right to do it as well. So you never really know how much of the detail of what the composer theoretically wanted, you're going to hear in any given performance. But approaches to the score tend to be quite different in interpretation, and there's a huge kind of battle between the people who think that you should be literally faithful to the score and those who think that you should be free to do what you want. This dichotomy is complete bullshit, frankly, because the reality is there is no such thing as a performance of anything which does not involve interpretation at a profound level, realizing what the performers think the composer meant. And no matter how literal you try to be, you are always interpreting. That is an absolute, inarguable fact. Indeed, I would argue that performances that tend to be literalist performances to the point where they draw attention to themselves, to the fact where you hear that these people are concerned with doing something specific on every note and making that specificity audible and doing it in a way that always draws attention to itself in terms of technical finish or the technical execution of the music. I would consider that kind of performance hideously exaggerated and completely opposed to what is written in the score. It's an interpretation. It's a grotesque interpretation. And you can go the other way. You can say, I'm not going to pay any attention to what's in there. I want to know what's behind the notes. I want to achieve the spiritual oneness and organic wholeness and philosophical, comprehensive, transcendental mastery that the composer was trying to express. And I can only do that by disregarding huge swaths of what's actually in there. And what's more, I don't care if the performers, let's say I'm a conductor like Furtwängler, can actually do it. I'm going to conduct my conception, and the orchestra will be, along for the ride. And if we miss things along the way, who cares? It's the conception that matters. That, too, is a hideous exaggeration in my view. Those two extremes, represented by conductors, for example, such as Toscanini and Furtwängler, that's the great dichotomy, are actually two sides of the same coin. It's just like saying in politics, the further left you are, the closer you are to the far right. And the far right you are, the closer you get to the crazy left. Why? Because they're fanatical. They're abstractions. They're not practical. They're not attempting to get to the essence of what this particular work says. They are rather generic concepts applied to everything willy-nilly. And at their best, both of those conductors could deliver transcendental performances. At their worst, they were self-parodies. They were, because, you can take anything to such extremes, and it became ultimately boring and predictable. You knew what they were going to do, and that isn't what you want. You want every piece to sound like it's fresh and new and spontaneous. And so the idea of the score, faithfulness to it, disregarding of it, the idea of what the composer's intentions are, which is really what a score is, that can be subsumed into a larger philosophy, which, if it becomes all encompassing, can actually really be detrimental to a successful performance of the work. It really can. This idea of score in the larger sense, the cultural and specific circumstances in which a work was written, is a very, very important one. But it can be taken too far. In the Romantic period, when we're talking about, the great megalomaniacal conductors like Furtwängler and Toscanini, it was taken too far in the form of, an interpreter's will being imposed on everything, which is great if the interpreter is a genius as great as the composer is. It's not so great when the interpreter is not. And most of the time, let's face it, the interpreter is not. In fact, I would go so far as to say most interpreters are not even particularly bright. If they were, they'd have done other things. They'd have been doctors or scientists or something. I don't know. But, the idea of the intelligence of the interpreter is one of those touchy topics people don't want to go into very much. But you could often tell, and some of them are not the elevator's not always going to the top floor there. So you have to be a little careful when you substitute your whim for that of the composer. That's why the score demands tremendous respect, but not slavish adherence. Because some composers weren't that bright, or they weren't very good at writing down what their intentions were. Everybody's different. Everybody is different. But one of the ways in which this idea of score in the larger sense has gotten in the way of the music happens in the period instrument world all the time. Because what's happened with the period instrument people is that they have substituted this concept of context, the cultural context, the performance practice of the era, which is their cultural context, for what the composer actually wrote. And to the extent we really know what that was, that can be marvelous. It really can be. But to the extent we don't know, which is much we don't know, a lot more than we do know, it can be just an excuse for that same kind of wanton exaggeration. I mean, let me give you a couple examples. I'll give you an example. Let's take Nicholas Harnoncourt. I'll give you two examples from Nicholas Harnoncourt. Harnoncourt was, I think, a brilliant, brilliant conductor who did unbelievably amazing things. But the unbelievably amazing things he did had nothing to do with him doing anything in a authentic or period performance kind of way. They all came from him, from his insight into the music, from his own innate musicality, not from the fact that he followed a prescription all the time. But when he did follow the prescription, as often as not, strange things happened. Take his overture to Don Giovanni. Now, you know how that sounds. Most of you do, right? Go listen to it. It's usually a bunch of chords with the double basses hanging over after the rest of the orchestra cuts out. A very threatening sound. It's bum, 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 like that, You hear the basses there, and it really sounds menacing. It's just marvelous. Well, Harnoncourt decided that Mozart made a mistake, that in those days, well, he didn't make a mistake. In those days, the convention was to write quarter notes or half notes or eighth notes or half notes, and they all meant the same thing. So that composers really meant for all the note values to be the same, even when they didn't write the same note values. So, is he right? We have no idea. Sometimes he probably was. But here, what happens when you have a composer who is incredibly sensitive to timbre and tone color and atmosphere, and he really wants you to play what he actually wrote? He doesn't want you to do the convention. How do you know? The answer is you don't. You have to let your own musicality be the guide, because both approaches might be equally faithful to the score. So Harnoncourt cuts the thing off. It just goes dum, 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 silence. Dum, 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 silence. Oh, that drove me crazy. I thought it sounded horrible. I thought it was such a stupid thing to do. Why not give Mozart the credit for having come up with a brilliant and marvelous bit of atmospheric tone color? And even if it's wrong, it's right to do it, because the music benefits from it. I thought the music benefited from it. And he did the same thing in Haydn's 102nd Symphony. The slow movement of Haydn's 102nd Symphony has some unbelievable orchestration, including muted trumpets for like the first time in the history of the universe or something. Anyway, it's got muted trumpets, which you don't hear most of the time because they're just there to add a certain color to the overall sound. They don't play solo except in one moment after the big climax of the movement. There's a big pause, but the trumpets don't cut off, and you hear. It's very alarming and quite strange, and it can sound like a mistake if you don't do it right. Harnoncourt, of course, cuts them off. So you don't hear that one moment where the muted trumpets get their solo lick. Now, knowing Haydn as we do, he wanted that moment where the trumpets get their solo lick to be audible. That's why he didn't cut off the trumpets. Harnoncourt cuts off the trumpets. He's considering the score in the wider sense rather than the specifics of what the composer really wrote. Is he right? Is he wrong? I don't know. Another example is that ridiculous anti-musical diminuendo at the end of Schubert's Ninth Symphony. I mean, how anybody could think that because Schubert wrote really long, they look like decrescendo marks, actually means a decrescendo in these cases is just insane. I mean, it's so completely, to me, obviously unmusical and foolish, but conductors did it. Conductors did it all the time, most famously Georg Schulte. I mean, in his horrible Schubert Ninth, there is no way in hell that a symphony that has spent the better part of an hour working itself up to this giant C major peroration, and in the finale of that symphony, the coda, bum, 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 ba-da-dum, 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 ba-da-dum. And then the end, it's, da, 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 dum, ba-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, and it's going crazy, dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Then it's da, 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 dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. Yes, it's da-dum, ba-dum. No, it's not. It can't be. It absolutely can't be. It just pulls the rug out. Some people think, oh, well, Schubert was like dying of syphilis and he was deeply miserable. And they're putting themselves into the brain of the composer, stupidly, and telling us that brain was a lot more disturbed and messed up than the music is telling us it was at the time that it was written. It makes no sense at all. No sense at all. I mean, there are works, Beethoven's Second Symphony, for example. Nobody plays Beethoven's Second Symphony as if Beethoven was it was the same year that he wrote, the same period where he wrote the Heiligenstadt Testament. He realized he was going deaf, and he wrote this passionate, horrible outpouring. He was considering suicide, and he wrote this sunny, lovely symphony. And people always play it as a sunny, lovely symphony because in Beethoven's case, you have no choice. The music doesn't allow you any opportunity to do anything else to it other than what it is. He didn't write funny accents, so there isn't a question. Stravinsky's Symphony in C, one of his most sort of cool neoclassical pieces, was written at a horrible time in his life. His wife was dying of tuberculosis. Everybody was in a sanatorium. I mean, it was a totally awful period. And he wrote this very crisp, clean, neat work that, you can't in any way make it reflect the circumstances of the composer, the personal circumstances in which it was written. And that's the way it is with lots and lots of music. So you have to be very, very careful when you decide how much of the exterior, that which is not within the score, you're going to allow into the score. Otherwise, very, very strange and terrible things might happen, as they do at the end of that Schubert Ninth, or, Harnoncourt's Mozart and Haydn decisions. Now, these are tiny details. They're small details. Harnoncourt's Haydn is often splendid. It's often perverse. But it isn't because of the score. It's because of the way he is reading the score and realizing it in sound. And that's one of the things that makes this whole thing so fabulous. So I don't want to belabor this point endlessly. But what I do want to say is that ideally, it may seem very bland and bourgeois of me to say that, radical isn't good. But it's not that radical isn't good. It's that everything has to achieve a happy medium. You need to have a medium. You need to be intelligent. You need to have a wider knowledge of the composer and his era. And you have to have basic, innate, inbred, inborn musicality and allied to that superb training. And I want to just close with a thought that George Sell once shared, which I always thought was very, very interesting. He said, if I have two conducting students, one of whom is just this fabulous communicator, I mean, the orchestra loves them, and they get along wonderfully, and, it's all terrific. And another one who is awkward and maybe a little bit, sort of socially, handicapped, but they're incredibly well prepared, and they know the music backwards, forwards, and sideways. He said, I will always take that one over the more charismatic one, because ultimately, what tells is musicality. It's musical preparation. It's knowing what the thing is, what it says, and what it's trying to do, rather than the ability to schmooze, to get along, even to get the orchestra to do what you want. Because one way will deliver what the composer wants. And, in Cell's own career was sort of an illustration of that, because he wasn't the nicest guy. He wasn't the easiest person to get along with, but he had a profound musicality, which has made so many of his recordings reference editions that have survived to this day. And not only have they survived to this day, but the way that he trained that orchestra to play survives to this day. It's astonishing. It's a vindication of the fact that behind all of this, behind the map, the score, the intention, there is the way to play music in a convincing way, and in a way that respects the fundamentals of what the thing really is. And that is ultimately, it may be that Zell believed you could train that or whip that into somebody, but ultimately, too, it's just as much a gift, and a rare one at that. So anyway, those are some thoughts on scores and following scores, and what the score is, and how much you pay attention to it, and what's going to happen when you look at it, and all of those things. I just hope this provides a little food for thought as you consider your own reaction to various interpretations and what you really think is going on in the performance. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.